The Touhou games are great bullet hell shoot-em-ups that aren't often acknowledged within the indie scene. People often give credit to Cave Story, and rightfully so. That game is excellent, but Touhou came before Cave Story and has a lot going for it. For some reason, I never identified Touhou as indie, but maybe that's just because the franchise is so massive. The game somehow inspired a cult following that even rivals franchises with much bigger budgets and reach. Over the years, many Touhou fan games have come out. These titles vary in both quality and genre, such that it's hard to know what to expect next. Though there are some that adhere to the tried and true, the more experimental titles stand out in interesting and creative ways. Games like Scarlet Curiosity, Third Eye, Luna Nights, and now Mechanical Scrollery. The story stars Marissa and Reimu solving a new mystery involving generic robot dudes and yokai corrupted novels. The duo enters these strange books to take down huge swarms of these bland robots in an effort to solve the case. Outside of the books, they're in a bookstore inhabited by a couple of side characters. This creates a weird scenario in which the core gameplay feels disconnected from the story taking place outside of the books. I don't know a lot about these side characters as they're tied to the Forbidden Scrollery manga, which I haven't read. The game has visual novel sequences with nice live 2D animations, though some animations seem like they're missing a couple of frames, which look kinda janky. In terms of gameplay, Mechanical Scrollery echoes Zone of the Enders, but with a Touhou twist. As somewhat of a fan of the series, I've always wanted to play a 3D Touhou game that lets you dodge bullets in mid-air, and Mechanical Scrollery delivers this very experience. However, it's an unpolished game that's ultimately repetitive and shallow, but it is definitely a start to the sort of 3D Touhou dream game I have in mind. This particular vision I have is something like the Marissa vs. Flanra Touhou 3D video on YouTube. It looks kinda dated in 2020 and feels a bit cheesy at times, but it's still a great video nonetheless. It's interesting to think about how someone could translate the beautiful, chaotic bullet hell patterns of Touhou into 3D, while making it fun to dodge and fight back in. Rather than a top-down view, you'd be limited in what you can show the player, and the tight control found in the mainline Touhou games is hard to recreate in 3D. This isn't even accounting for the hitboxes that would be even harder to identify with 3D models, as well as the inherently restrictive camera. I'd be very impressed if anyone had examples of games that successfully did something like this, or if anyone had any neat ideas that would work in a 3D Touhou adaptation. Anyway, Mechanical Scrollery is an ambitious 2D to 3D adaptation sorta in line with what I was talking about. However, there is a notable lack of vision as to how the precise, careful gameplay of a bullet hell shoot-em-up would translate in the 3D space. It's certainly closer to a Zone of the Enders clone than a straight-up 3D Touhou adaptation. In Mechanical Scrollery, the combat largely involves flying up to enemies and endlessly hacking away at them, while holding down the shoot button for maximum damage. Shooting enemies requires ammo, which is obtained by hacking and slashing, or dodging enemy fire at the right time. Usually, the enemies were inaccurate, and the dodge was very liberal with regards to what was considered well-timed. Though enemies have unique attack patterns, dealing with them never really changed. Simply put, the gameplay is repetitive and just kinda boring. There is a little more depth in the fact that you can change from the hack and slash mode to the aiming mode that transforms the combat to more of a third-person shooter type of affair, but it was largely pointless. Enemies are often bulky bullet sponges that often soak tons of damage for lengthy periods of time. The aiming mode only lets you shoot, while the hacking and slashing mode lets you shoot and use melee at the same time. The latter not only acts as a source of damage, but as a way to regenerate the ammo needed to shoot in the first place. Sure, the aiming mode lets you precisely aim where you want to shoot, but it never really felt necessary. The hack and slash mode shooting does have an auto aim which is unreliable in who it targets, but it was good enough for most of my normal mode playthrough. Finally, there are satisfying spell cards that act as powerful moves that can only be used once you max out the spell meter. It builds up when dealing damage to enemies, and the spell you cast largely depends on the weapon you have equipped. One of the main draws of the gameplay would definitely have to be the movement. Moving often had a good flow to it, though the elevation controls took some getting used to. Regardless, the original Zone of the Enders felt far more polished, and that game is almost 2 decades old. I mean, it's a game that nailed concepts all the way back then that this game still struggles with. For example, Zone of the Enders had your character automatically rotate towards the enemy when locked on. This made the combat flow seamlessly such that the player didn't have to awkwardly adjust their elevation if they were slightly off from the enemy. In Mechanical Scrollery, they'll have to do that a lot. Regardless, I'm not here to sing all of Zone of the Enders' praises, it's just that that game tackled this type of gameplay particularly well. I actually did a review on the sequel a while back if you want to know what I think about that. Anyway, there's definitely an amateurish quality to the Mechanical Scrollery that hampers a lot of the experience. The way levels are used is reminiscent of Super Mario 64 in that areas are reused for different objectives due to constraints. In Mario's case, it was the limited space of the cartridge, and in Mechanical Scrollery's case, it seems to be a lack of time or resources. Super Mario 64 would have the player play through the same levels in different ways. For example, in Bob-omb Battlefield, you can get a star from releasing a chain chomp or by gathering all the red coins. This is a case where the developers weren't able to just make tons of levels for their game and made use of what they had instead. However, in Mechanical Scrollery's case, the change in objectives is just a matter of who to kill next. Each chapter has a single level of usually around 10 missions that vary from kill this bat to kill this spider. To spice it up, you might even need to kill 3 spiders and maybe even 2 bats. There's a clear lack of gameplay variety in this setup, and it doesn't help that the game never points out where the enemy is located. I'd often have to scour large bland levels for enemies that would only appear in a single place. I would scan the level for a sky dragon in the air, but it would then turn out that it was just hanging out on the ground. Sure, one can argue that the variety comes from different enemy configurations and whatnot, but I'd just rinse and repeat the same old tactics regardless of which enemies were grouped up together. Not only that, there aren't any cool one-on-one boss fights and no neat showdowns against any of the well-established Touhou cast. All I can say is that it's just one big missed opportunity. Mechanical Scrollery dabbles with rudimentary RPG mechanics, including a level up system, weapon crafting, enemy drops, and an item system. With the ability to play as both Marissa and Reimu, the player can choose between the two of them at any time, though not in the middle of battle. I appreciate that they do differentiate them in ways that call back to their Touhou roots. Reimu's shots are a lock-on affair, while Marissa's is closer to auto-shooting. While Marissa's fire rate is higher, Reimu's shots seem to home in on enemies. For me, I just stuck with Marissa most of the time as she's cooler and I can just hold down the shoot button rather than having to continuously release it to shoot as Reimu. Enemies drop items upon death, which can be used for upgrading weapons and unlocking levels. Though it's a decent idea, it also provides padded gameplay that had me just repeating levels for the sake of enemy drops. Items can be used at any time to heal or buff stats, essentially throwing challenge out of the window. As I played the game, I couldn't help but note how poorly it ran. My high-end rig was chugging hard on the menu selection screen and I had no idea why. It was a case of poor optimization due to the game's crappy water effects running in the background. After beating the game, the developers released a patch fixing the problem. Ultimately, the issue is obsolete, but during my time playing, I experienced abysmal technical problems, setting a bad impression. That's the problem with reviews in the age of online patches. One day, there's a major issue. The next, it doesn't even exist anymore. Mechanical Scrollery is an experimental title that is rough around the edges. There's certainly some ambition with regard to the scope of the game, but the lack of polish and vision ultimately hindered the experience. Though I found some enjoyment in the mindless and mediocre gameplay, it's not something I'd be eager to return to. Past the core combat, the RPG system provides character progression that delivered passable incentives for getting through the game, but it often felt too shallow to even mention most of the time. I'm not even sure if it's worth mentioning right now. Overall, Mechanical Scrollery is not a title I'd recommend, as there are plenty of more polished and creative Touhou fan games out there. Luna Knights and the previously mentioned Scarlet Curiosity in particular stand out in that regard. I actually reviewed Scarlet Curiosity a while back if you want to check that out. I'll put a link in the description. Though Mechanical Scrollery was unable to be the Touhou game of my dreams, there's always hope for the future. Thanks for watching the review. If you enjoyed it, please like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. I wrote the original review for Dark Station, and a review copy was provided. If you want more, here are some of my other videos. Anyway, I'll see you all next time when I review Doom Eternal and Final Fantasy VII Remake at the same time.